So recently I did a video about my book which came out recently, a collection of essays I edited in collaboration with a team of researchers which is called Rise of the Roguelite. I wrote the introduction and a chapter, and I thought today I could give you a bit of a sense of what my chapter is about. It's about Vampire Survivors and the sorts of games inspired by it, and I talk about these games in connection with Michel Foucault's philosophy of power. Given how many mechanics roguelites have in common, it's remarkable how many different types of roguelites there are. There have been turn-based strategy roguelites, real-time action roguelites, deck building, card games, slot machine, billiard and Metroidvania roguelites, amongst other types. But one of the most significant and popular types of roguelite to emerge in the last few years has been the dozens of games inspired by Luca Galante's Vampire Survivors. Games now often commonly referred to as survivors-likes or bullet heavens. I think by looking at survivors-likes in connection with the philosophy of Michel Foucault, we can get an understanding of a particular aspect of how he thought power worked, and how survivors-likes convey this idea of power to players, even if they don't explicitly think this is what they're doing. Video games exhibit a strong connection to power. In them, you rise through the ranks of criminal organisations, win wars, destroy armies of zombies, and fight as powerful superheroes. Such games are compelling in part because they appeal to our power fantasies. But video games can also engage with the idea of power itself, often explicitly through narratives. But here I'm more interested in how games can convey certain insights about the nature of power, for instance, even though that isn't what they're meant to be doing. Certain games, like Vampire Survivors and Brotato, because of how they're structured, are reflective of an aspect of power that Foucault refers to in one of his last books, a book called The History of Sexuality, an aspect of power that he called the support which force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or system. In the chapter I call this a principle of synergy, because the idea behind it is basically that force relations can synergize with each other, achieving a degree of power working together that's greater than the sum of what they would achieve working separately. These games are able to reflect this idea because of what Ian Bogost called procedural rhetoric, meaning the art of persuasion through rule-based representations and interactions, rather than words and moving pictures. I'll do a video in the future just about procedural rhetoric, but it's basically the idea that just as you can make arguments and convey ideas through words and pictures, you can also do it through computer-generated systems and representations. Through procedural rhetoric, video games can be more than just fun. They can make arguments which shape our perspective on the world. Many games are educational about political power through procedural rhetoric. The democracy games show players the political balancing act of democratic rule, and the Crusader Kings games have incredibly detailed simulations of medieval rule. But this is explicitly what these games are trying to do. They're politics simulators. Games like Vampire Survivors and Brotato reflect the nature of power implicitly through procedural rhetoric, because they present players with numerous elements which can either increase or decrease their power, challenging them to chain these elements together in the most powerful way possible, exploiting the natural support they can give one another. Essentially, they put you in a position where you have to exploit Foucault's principle of synergy to succeed, and they make this the most important skill required to play the game. Michel Foucault, by the way, is the most cited scholar in the human sciences. There are more references to and citations of Foucault's work than that of any other researchers. And even though he didn't think of power as the ultimate goal or endpoint of his work, Foucault is well known for writing about power. He discussed it constantly in different forms. Early in his career, Foucault essentially thought of power as a negative, prohibitive thing wielded by powerful institutions. Through power, wielded by the state or the sovereign or other powerful forces, we are controlled, prohibited, forbade from doing particular things. But Foucault's view of power had evolved considerably by the time he wrote The History of Sexuality. He would later say in an interview that the whole point of the history of sexuality lies in a re-elaboration of the theory of power. Between every point of a social body, between a man and a woman, between the members of a family, between a master and his pupil, between everyone who knows and everyone who does not, there exist relations of power, which are not simply a projection of the sovereign's great power over the individual. They are rather the concrete, changing soil in which the sovereign's power is grounded, the conditions that make it possible for it to function. For the later Foucault, force relations exist between every single point of a social body, in all places and contexts. As Richard A. Lynch puts it, force relations consist of whatever in one's social interactions pushes, urges, or compels one to do something. Foucault sometimes used the phrase microphysics of power, because the force relation functions just like an atom of power. Just as molecules are built from simpler atoms, complex power structures are built from the same basic force relations present throughout society. This means, as he says in the interview Truth and Power, that the state consists in the codification of a whole number of power relations that render its functioning possible. Revolution is a different type of codification of the same relations. Whether we're discussing how power oppresses and controls, or how it's resisted and strategized against, we're talking about the same force relations. In one incredibly dense sentence of the history of sexuality, he says, "It seems to me that power must be understood in the first instance as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. As the process which, through ceaseless struggles and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses them, as the support which these force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system, or on the contrary, the disjunctions and contradictions which isolate them from one another, and lastly, as the strategies in which they take effect, whose general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the state apparatus, in the formulation of the law, in the various social hegemonies." We'll be focusing only on the third aspect, the support which force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system, which I refer to as a principle of synergy, where synergy has its normal meaning of the combined power of a group of things when they're working together that's greater than the total power achieved by each working separately. Force relations can synergize with one another when combined correctly, but can also work badly together or cancel each other out. So, I went through a period where I played a lot of Vampire Survivors and Brotato, especially Brotato, which I think, from the perspective of games and game design, is a work of unadulterated genius. Not bad for a game where you play as a potato. I think these intimately related games resonate strongly with and reflect the idea behind Foucault's principle of synergy. An understanding of and the ability to manipulate powerful synergies is required to succeed, and it's arguably the most important skill required to play the game. Vampire Survivors is one of the indie game industry's biggest success stories in recent memory. Developed by one person very cheaply, using quite outdated graphics by today's standards, retailing at £5, it's a richly strategic, highly playable experience behind a deceptively simple surface. It sold 2.5 million copies in a few months, an additional 3 million on mobile, received some industry awards, and spawned an entire subgenre which has become remarkably prolific, with a new version seemingly being released every week. Brotato stands out as one of the most popular among games directly inspired by Vampire Survivors, and arguably the best, at least in my opinion. The objective of Vampire Survivors is to survive for the allotted time against increasingly large and more dangerous waves of enemies, none of whom at any point seem to be vampires. The map size is unlimited. Each character starts off with one weapon, and all weapons are fired automatically. So all you have to do is move, collect health, collect blue XP gems when enemies die, and upgrade your character. When you have enough XP, you level up, and get a choice between 3 randomly generated items: weapons, defensive buffs, and so on. You can have up to 6 weapons, which can all be evolved into much stronger versions of themselves by collecting the right additional items. With the resources on offer, The player must become as powerful as possible and survive. It's the definition of pick up and play, remarkably accessible, addictive, and already imitated by numerous games since. And all you have to really do in these games is move and make choices. Two types of choice: how to move and how to build your character. While the latter is more important, a lot of tactical thinking is already involved in the movement, which an article in Rock, Paper, Shotgun captured in relatable fashion when talking about Brotato. A simple problem. I want to take out the monsters who are strengthening their pals. These buff givers shuffle away, so lots of monsters are between me and them. Well, many of those will die in one hit, so I can charge into them and trust they'll be dead before they make contact. But I can't run directly to the buffers because ranged attackers are hanging back and filling the screen with shots, so I'll need to dodge shots and clear out the spitters. But I can't snake too wide or I'll run into the chunky lads who are basically harmless until I hit them, at which point they'll spawn more ranged attackers. But I do need to snake enough to dodge the big lads who charge up into a dash attack, and sustain the snake long enough to take down the armoured ones. And ideally I'd like to swing by that pile of XP sitting over there, or chase down the treasure, or I could lead them past my turret, or... This is less than a second of thought and action, which becomes instinct as you weave through the dozens of enemies on screen. Brotato builds on the Vampire Survivors formula. Attacks are automatic, your main concern is moving and collecting XP, there's a maximum of 6 weapons, and when you level up you decide how to upgrade your character, become more powerful, and survive against hordes of increasingly dangerous enemies. But the tweaks Brotato makes to this formula arguably make it a strategically deeper game. It dramatically limits the map size, divides each run into 20 distinct waves, and most importantly, adds a shop that you visit in between waves to spend the materials you've gathered, either on weapons or items that change your character's stats. Through the shop, you can build your character in considerably more fine-grained detail than in Vampire Survivors. Most of the strategic thinking in Brotato happens in the shop. Some items have no drawbacks, others give long-term benefits with short-term risks. Most involve a trade-off where some stats increase at the expense of others, so you're constantly making decisions about what to prioritise and at the expense of what. Through the shop alone, Brotato adds layers of depth to the Vampire Survivors formula, but it also features dozens of different characters which vary considerably in playstyle, adding even more complexity. The goal of Vampire Survivors and Brotato, the end game, is to survive until the end. But the crucial thing for achieving this goal, the thing the player is really striving for from moment to moment, is to increase power. You can be as skillful as you like at the walking aspect of the game, positioning yourself, avoiding attacks and so on. But if you don't build your character well, you will fail. The ability to identify and exploit the powerful synergies between the in-game elements, to use them to naturally support each other, is crucial for success. Foucault's claim was that there is a natural support which force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system. And without this being their explicit aim, the procedural rhetoric of games like Vampire Survivors and Brotato conveys this point through their mechanics, essentially putting players in a position where they must understand and be able to work with this idea to succeed. Different force relations can form a chain in which they work with, naturally support, and strengthen each other. I've spoken of this in terms of synergy, the potential for them to achieve more working together than their sum working separately. Vampire Survivors and Brotato both present the player with a wide variety of elements, statistics, weapons, and items that allow the player to increase or decrease in power based on the decisions they make. And they then challenge the player to make the strongest chain of power possible. To be successful, the player must work out which elements work together, which don't, and exploit synergies to increase their power. Games like them function like laboratories in which players experiment with different configurations of power to find the different ways that their constituent elements can synergize. Now, games like this don't mention Foucault at all. obviously, but through their procedural rhetoric, which arises through the interaction of their systems, the deployment of their mechanics. The idea behind Foucault's principle is very much present and experienced quickly and vividly. Without saying that this is what they're doing, games like this convey something about the operation and functioning of systems of power by putting certain elements of them on display and by showing us how they work. So that's the basic idea behind my chapter. I go into a lot more detail there, especially about Foucault's philosophy and why he was doing the kind of work he was doing, as well as about Vampire Survivors and Brotato, and about everything really. But this is just a kind of condensed idea of it to give you a sense of what I was talking about in the chapter of my book. So as always, thank you so much for watching. Do like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, and we'll see you next time.